Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our monthly installment of the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center's monthly science seminar. I'm Melissa Welch. I am the program manager for the Midwest CASC, part of the Midwest CASC consortium staff hosted at the University of Minnesota in service to the center. Welcome to everyone on this beautiful, albeit weirdly hot day across the Midwest. A big welcome to folks who are joining us for the first time and our repeat customers already familiar with the Midwest CASC's work. As always, a big thanks to the great work of our communications manager, Jess Del Fiacco, for organizing this session, and also a thanks to our speakers who will be presenting to you in just a few moments. For those of you familiar with our work, you know we use the term CASC. That's the acronym for the Climate Adaptation Science Center, so we'll be using that throughout today's presentation. And again, we are recording this seminar as we generally do, so please adjust your video settings accordingly based on if you would like to be in live video or not, and please mute your microphones throughout today's session. If you have any questions at any point for us or our speakers, please feel free to drop those into the Zoom chat for our attention. Jess, can I have you flip slides for me, please? Before we begin, we do a kind of standard "this is us" intro slide to let you know a little bit more about who the CASC is and what the CASC does. The Midwest CASC really prioritizes regional research projects and collaborations, as evidenced on the slide here, a map of our regional partners and institutions with USGS and 8 institutions across the region. As I mentioned, we're hosted at the University of Minnesota. We're also part of a national network of regional CASCs, all working to produce science that seeks to inform management efforts to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to a changing climate. We work on specific topics related to our Midwest region, both at our center and the PIs across the region, our researchers across the region. We do this in several primary ways, including conducting synthesis research projects on relevant regional priorities. We support a network of interns, graduate students, and postdoctoral fellows through our early career researcher programming. We support a broad network of USGS-funded climate adaptation projects. And we also host capacity building workshops and an annual gathering of our Midwest CASC community, like the one that we recently held at the University of Illinois. Jess, if you could flip slides, we'll show a picture of that group there. And that was a beautiful summer day there too. You can read more about our August Summer Symposium and find links to the recorded sessions both in the newsletter that you may have received this morning, as well as on our website. And we'll pop a link, thanks Sarah, to that recap of the symposium there in the chat. Before we begin our formal presentation today, I'm delighted to, upcoming events. We have a busy month coming up of events, and let me make that slide bigger so I can read it better. The events coming up on our radar are on October 6th, that's a week from today. There will be a report out of our very first synthesis project hosted at University of Minnesota and led by postdoctoral researcher Dr. Diele Lobo. That is a hybrid event. Join us in person if you're able, or visit the events page for a link to register for that. On October 9th, the Midwest CASC is co-hosting a presentation with Indiana University's Environmental Resilience Institute to welcome Dr. Songlin Fei to talk about AI and digital technology related to forestry. On October 23rd, we have our next quarterly Community of Practice meeting where we will be talking about wetlands restoration. If you are all into wetlands restoration, topics of a similar nature, or want to learn more about what's being done related to technology use, collaboration in the wetland space, please reach out to join us for that meeting. And then finally, on October 30th, we are planning a virtual a science showcase. We're calling Science in Action Informing Natural Resource Management in the Midwest, where we will be featuring project partners presenting on how they have gone about their research related to the Midwest CASC management challenges. So again, visit our website to learn more about those. And now I'm delighted to welcome Grace Afram. Grace is a new postdoctoral scholar working at IU Bloomington to lead the synthesis research project there. Welcome, Grace. Would you like to go live on your video and say hello for a moment?
Yeah, thanks, Alyssa, for the nice introduction. Hi, everybody. My name is Grace Afram. So I'm a new postdoc at the Midwest CASC, specifically at Indiana University Bloomington. So my research basically focuses on exploring the role of urban systems and green infrastructure in fostering climate resilience in the Midwestern ecosystem. So my a little bit about my background is I've worked intensively with the Southwest CASC during my time as a PhD student at Utah State University, where I specifically studied climate science. So we basically investigated the drivers of the US hydroclimate using hydrology models, climate models, and some coupled model experiments. So yeah, I'm happy to be here. I'm excited to collaborate and work with you all. So thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Grace. We're happy to work with you as well. And I'm going to hand it over to Jess Delfiaco, our communications manager, to introduce our speakers for today. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Alyssa, and welcome again, Grace. We're so happy to have you as part of our team. And I am excited to introduce today's speakers. We have Nick Haddad, who is the professor of integrated biology at Michigan State University, and he directs the long-term ecological research site at Kellogg Biological Station there, as well as Elise Zipkin. She is also a professor in the Department of Integrated Biology, and she directs MSU's Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior program. And I think Elise is going to go up first with her presentation. Elise, I'm going to stop sharing and you should be able to pull up your slides.
Okay. Do you guys see that?
We do.
Okay, excellent. You can hear me? We're good? Okay.
What's that?
Thanks to the CASC for inviting us to come talk today. So here's how it's going to work. I'm going to start a little bit with a overview of a working group that both Nick and I were part of. So this was a USGS funded Powell Center working group where the goal was to look at the status of butterflies in the US across the US by integrating multiple different data sources. And after I go through this presentation, Nick is going to take over and he's going to talk a little bit more about some specific butterflies and rare butterflies and go into a little bit more details on some of the drivers, which isn't something that we looked at in this group, but is something that individually we've done and are thinking about doing. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to talk about this status of butterflies across the US project. And so the goal of our project was really to figure out, all right, how are butterflies doing? There had been a lot of piecemeal work showing, individual species declines in certain areas of the US, in some place looking at regions of different butterfly populations there. But really our goal overall was to say, all right, what can we synthesize about butterflies more generally? So the leaders of this working group were Cheryl Schultz, Elizabeth Crone, and Wade Thodmartin. And we met 3 times from 2022 to 2024. And we had a couple of different goals. Our first goal was kind of just overall to say, what can we do if we synthesize all of the available data that we have to say, what can we say about the trends? We wanted to get a little bit into distributions. So try to understand if we could, which we sort of coined range blobs. So we wanted to understand what were those ranges across the US. And some groups were looking at, are they changing? And really a kind of secondary goal, mostly because of time, was to look at drivers, and subsets of groups did that, but we didn't do that so much as a larger group. And so this was a really large working group. And actually, I think the CASC actually funded part of this, the National CASC funded part of this. And we brought 25 government scientists, academic scientists, and we wanted to also invite people who had kind of data owners, so people who had been doing long-term regional studies. And from this program, what we basically did was aggregated all available regional scale butterfly monitoring programs. So that was 35 different programs. And mostly they were focused on multiple species, although there were a couple that were focused on individual species. And the first task really was just putting all those data together. So harmonizing those different data sources was actually a process that probably took about a year and a half, just trying to be able to put them in an approach where we could use them all together. So a little bit about the summary of the data that we had. So of those 25 monitoring programs, we had observed in there were 12.6 million individual butterflies. So there were more than 76,000 surveys analyzed, 35 monitoring programs, I said, that's 35. And what you can see here on this map is the spatial distribution of the locations. So for example, if you're just looking at the Midwest, right, we have some of the highest densities of butterfly surveys, which makes it a great place to study butterflies. And for example, something in the Mountain Prairie, you can see that there's a lot less surveys. So even though this was a lot of data, there are still gaps in where we have information. So we aggregated the data into these U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service regions. And we did that for a couple of reasons. We wanted to understand what was going on regionally. We thought it made sense to do this based on, these are somewhat climate oriented, but they're also management oriented regions. So we thought that might be a good way to aggregate the space. And overall, there were 554 unique species at more than almost 2,500 different locations. So we put these together to try and do a couple things. First is we wanted to estimate a trend in total butterfly abundance across the lower 48 from 2000 to 2020, and in each of those regions. So we settled on the year 2000 for starting on this because there really was very, very small amount of data available before that, and it was highly regionally biased. So there were a couple of surveys that happened before the year 2000, but not so many that we felt that quantifying the trends was going to be a reasonable thing to do. And then what we did is after that, we estimated species level abundance for 342 species with sufficient data. So I told you that we saw 550 something. But unfortunately, we weren't able to analyze all those species individually. Some of them were very rare. Some of them are really heavily spatially restricted or really required certain kinds of surveys to be able to really look at trends overall. And that wasn't necessarily data available that we had in these butterfly monitoring programs. So when we were estimating the individual's trends, we counted for the species range, phenology, which we knew changed by different species, and the amount of survey effort. And we also then wanted to look kind of overall, could we quantify something about changes in species richness? So in these different regions. And I'll just tell you, so our approach was after we built these individual models, this was, we had 2 expert reviewers from our group review each of the results, because the approach that we take was consistent across the different species, but we wanted to be able to, keep that the same, but also not include anything that really didn't make any sense. So for the most part, that was fine, but there were a few cases where we just threw out our analysis because we felt like, yeah, you know what, based on the available data, this doesn't make sense for these species. So each thing was kind of checked based on the known biology. So out of this project, we had basically two big papers, reports. The first is one that was published earlier in Science, earlier this year in Science magazine. And that was led by postdoc Colin Edwards. So he was the postdoc officially affiliated with the USGS working group. And then a second paper was published by Xerces, and that is what we call State of the Butterflies in the US. Thinking just about also the synthesis, but also a little bit thinking about what this means for conservation. And the leader of that paper was Cheryl Schultz, and also published earlier this year. So I'll be showing the results from overall this work, the bigger picture stuff. So the first is what we found is that butterflies are declining across the continental US. So we estimated total abundance decreased by about 1.3% annually. So that is a cumulative decline of about 22% of those 554 butterfly species between the year 2000 to 2022. So what that means is that for every 5 butterflies, that one would see walking around in the year 2000, there's only going to be about 4 now. So this line here, the black line, shows kind of that decline. So that's our abundance index. And then these points here, this is not a line fit to these points, but these points are showing the mean survey counts per year. So this is across all the different data sources that we have. So just the point of this is just to show that, our abundance indices that we use in our modeling approach, broadly mimics what we're seeing in the mean surveys counts. Okay, so then what we found also is that more than 70% of the species were declining. So the median species declined by about 2.6 annually. So that resulted in a cumulative decline of 41.5% after 2 decades. So that's a pretty big decline. And then what we found is that 72% of individual butterfly species were declining or possibly declining, and only 19% of species, so that's 65 out of 342, were increasing or possibly increasing. So let me just tell you what I mean by this possibly increasing or possibly declining. So we categorize the species as, declining or increasing if that 95% confidence interval did not overlap 0. So p-value less than 0.5. However, for many of the species, and this included all the species that had a change between something like negative 80% overall and positive 10%, we actually didn't find any of those species had a statistically significant change. So what does that mean? I think that basically means that if you have a small change, a small decrease annually or small increase annually, it's very hard to pick that up. So we categorize species that had plus or minus 10% cumulative change as possibly, but not a statistically significant one, as possibly declining or possibly increasing. So the declines were prevalent across families. So more than 60% of species declined in each of the families that we studied. So some were hit a little bit harder than others. But what you can see mostly overall is that very few species, were definitely increasing, whereas we saw, very many species and across families with, a lot of consistency declining. So this is just, a figure here showing the individual species that are declining. So this is what I'm showing here in this first panel. A and in B are the most extreme 1/3 of increasers. So that's 3 out of 9 species that are increasing. And B is the most extreme 1/3 of decliners, 38 out of 114 species. So this also, without going into the individual species that are increasing or decreasing, you can see the kind of huge difference in the numbers that are increasing versus decreasing. All right, so this is a figure, and this comes directly from the Xerces report, where we were pulling out individual species and looking, okay, so for every 10 butterflies in the year 2000, how many are left? So pulling out species of interest and different across different families. And this just shows a little bit of a chart, right, that kind of highlights some of the extremes, right? So some of the species that are declining on the top there quite a bit, and seeing how many are left. So when we're looking at this, right, it starts to get a little bit nerve-wracking about those extreme declines for some of those species that were declining the most. Interestingly, we found that on this spatial scale, across the lower 48, traits are a poor predictor of declines. So what does that mean? We did find that species with more positive trends were generally associated with longer wing length, so that's larger. They overwinter in a non-egg life stage. There was a slight preference for moist habitats that these species hosted. They were host plant generalists, and they were more likely to be associated with human-dominated habitat. So of the other traits we looked at, which was volatinism, so how frequently, the number of broods basically that they have a year, canopy affiliation, they had no discernible effects. So even though we saw these slight relationships that didn't really buffer species from declines, and in fact, these traits only explained about 9% of the variation in species trends. And once we controlled for phylogeny, so relatedness among species, we didn't see any apparent support for the effects of trends. So I don't think that this means that at small spatial scales, we're not seeing effects of traits, but really across the board at a very large spatial scale, we didn't really see that big a large spatial scale across a large set of species. We don't see that effects of traits so much. If we look what's going on regionally, we do see that there were declines basically across all the regions. So 6 of the 7 geographic regions had total butterfly declines ranging from 0.2 annually to 2.3% annually. So this is what this figure or this table on the left is showing you, the what that percent changes over the entire 20 years and what that annual change is. However, the Pacific Northwest was the only region that increased, but we found that this was because of the highly eruptive California tortoiseshell. So this was a species that had a big boom in abundance later in the time series. So I think it was about 2017, 2016, 2017, something around there. And so there was a big increase. We don't necessarily expect that that would continue. If we remove that really eruptive species, then we find that the region no longer increases. It doesn't decrease, but it's more stable. So this here shows just the number of species by different region that are declining, increasing, possibly declining, increasing, no change. So we can see overall, we've got much larger numbers of species that are declining than increasing, and that these annual percent changes by region, maybe not surprisingly, for example, we see the Southwest region having the largest negative changes, the most declining species. So not great. No one on the right-hand side of that 0 of percent annual change. And then for species richness, so this was an interesting thing that we did. We tried to look at, okay, what is the likely number of observable species in each region once we count for variable monitoring efforts? So we weren't able to estimate species richness exactly. So this is the basic idea, is that between 2000 and 2020, butterfly species richness fell in every region by as much as 28%, which could be as many as 30 species. But even in some of the other regions, for example, maybe the Pacific Northwest, where there are fewer butterflies to begin with, but also the declines were less steep, we still saw the loss of, up to about 5 or so species. So this is how likely we are to see species if we were going to these regions to count given the variable monitoring efforts. So overall, we found that species richness was declining. And this is a paper here, which was a follow-up to this, published by my graduate student, Wendy Leuenberger, earlier this year. And I think I didn't go too much into her research because I'm pretty sure she either gave a talk at the CASC recently or is planning to give one recently. And so she did an analysis where we really zoomed into the Midwest to look at how the composition of butterflies is changing through time. And this went back kind of further in time. This analysis went back to the early 1990s, because if you remember, the Midwest is one of those few areas where we were able to do that. And what we find is that in this case, in the Midwest, the community composition really changed. And that change is also driven by more severe loss in abundance, but not richness of common species compared to rare species. So that's maybe not surprising. You can lose a lot of abundance in species without actually losing the species in the location. So everything is kind of having a more even abundance and compositions are more similar. So in Wendy's paper, when we dug into the Midwest, we do see effects of traits and some changes in richness, a little bit by these trait groups. Maybe not quite as extreme because we're still seeing, declines of the species, but a little bit more breaking it down by these groups to see what's going on. So before I go and Nick takes over, I'll just kind of leave you with this thought as, right, of course, we should be really worried about butterflies in the US. They're definitely in peril. We see these broad changes to butterfly communities. And I think that suggests that there's not a single factor responsible for the decline. So this is a figure taken from Wagner et al. And it, really, I think highlights the point that, this death by 1,000 cuts, there's lots of different factors that are harming insects and butterflies specifically. And that might be, it's not so simple that we're going to be able to just fix one thing and have that work out. So I think this poses new challenges for us in thinking about conservation, because even common species are now declining. All right, so that's all I have, and I'm going to hand this over to Nick. I'm going to try to stop sharing. I think that worked. And Nick's going to talk to us a little bit more about some of those reasons and some specific species.
Okay, let's see, make sure you've got, okay, see my screen? Good. Okay, yeah, so thanks for having me, and Elise, everybody. We're very excited about the paper and work that Elise just talked to you about, and excited, so excited and distressed and depressed at the same time. And it leads to some follow-on questions that I'm going to address that aren't specifically about that study, but that springboard right off of it. So if we take that as the definitive study of the status of butterflies in the United States and this rapid long-term decline, then the immediate question that comes to mind is, well, what's causing the decline? And Elise just showed the most famous recent article describing all the causes of decline. And what I found is if you read articles on insect decline, they typically end with a paragraph or a few paragraphs on these three potential causes of decline without knowing what the cause actually is. So the big three are habitat loss, climate change, and use of toxic pesticides. And so what I'm going to first tell you about is a different study that we did. This was led by Braden Van Dynes, where we were working in the US Midwest, so our Midwest CASC region. And as Elise showed you, apparently people in the Midwest are very fond of collecting data on butterflies. What we did is brought together the butterfly data, the exact data that Elise was talking to you about in the Midwest, and then data for climate. Well, that's easy. We could all download temperature and precipitation data. Land use, also fairly easy, but then the hard one is data on pesticides. So we were able to gather data on all classes of pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, and particularly insecticides, and all varieties of them in the counties where there were butterfly surveys, and could ask, comparing apples to apples to apples, what is causing butterfly decline in the US Midwest? And what we found was pretty striking. And before telling you what we found, I have to say that in the time period, starting in the observable range of our butterfly declines, there's been dramatic change in the technologies put into controlling insect pests. And so they go from pre-1995 technologies like pyrethroids, so classes of chemicals, organophosphates. And then after 1995, this shift to genetically modified crops, so BT corn that is has traits that are toxic to insects, and then new classes of insecticides, particularly neonicotinoids, and seeds of corn and soybeans are coated with neonicotinoids and other insecticides. And the key difference is not just in the classes of things used to control insects, pest insects, but how they're applied. So before 1995, the technologies were reactive. Like you have a problem, you spray for the pests. After 1995, the treatments are prophylactic. We're putting BT traded corn into the environment. We're putting seeds coated with insecticides and fungicides already on every year. We're saturating in our environment with insecticides. Okay, so what do we find? The bottom line is we compared apples to apples to apples, insecticides, climate and land use. And we found that consistently insecticides rose to the top above and beyond climate and land use change in causing butterfly decline. And this was true for total butterfly abundance. It was true for number of butterfly species. And specifically, it was true for the monarch. And so this really caused us to focus in on the ubiquitous use of insecticides and saturating our environments with insecticides as a general cause of decline. Okay, so that's on the decline part. Now I'm going to move on to another topic that is kind of a springboard from the other, Elise's part of the talk. So Elise has ended up saying, even abundant species are declining. I mean, it is frightening to see that, well, we know monarchs are declining, to see that things like cabbage whites, this invasive butterfly that we all see if we grow broccoli or cabbage, see eating our broccoli and cabbage plants, they're declining. But I'm going to go to the other end of the spectrum, which wasn't a focus of our paper, but on the very rarest species, and to tell you that species are being lost. And so I'm going to start with a butterfly that I've studied for over 2 decades. This is called the St. Francis satyr butterfly. And so this takes us outside of the Midwest CASC region. I'll show you the global distribution of the St. Francis satyr is shown in blue on this map. And so if you just squint in, you can see that little dot in southern North Carolina. And where is this butterfly found? Well, I'm right now, so there were historically, over the last 20 years, about 3,000 total of these butterflies on the face of the earth, and they're all limited to one place. And so here I'm standing at the center of their range. I have this smile on my face because I'm about, 10 meters away from 30 of the 3,000 butterflies existing, but I have a bigger smile on my face because the center of the butterfly's range is an army installation, and the center of its range is a bomb range on this army installation. So I'm standing in the middle of the bomb range, and well, I made it so far, so big smile. And so when I was sent out 20 years ago to work on this butterfly, I was asked to monitor the populations outside the bomb range. So these numbers and letters just refer to different populations. And very quickly, they started to be lost, be extirpated. And one after the other, these butterflies were lost. And I realized, man, we're I had had this policy of, just don't mess with the butterfly habitats and maybe they'll be okay. But it just made me realize how arrogant and ignorant I was about like going in and trying to do butterfly conservation. It's harder than it seems. And so then I realized we had to change our path completely, and we started doing big restoration projects for the butterfly. They live in abandoned wetlands, so we created wetlands. This is like my second favorite tool in my lab's toolbox. So my first favorite tool is a butterfly net, but the second favorite are these things called aquadams, where you fill up like essentially long inner tubes with water from a stream, and it makes these dams where we're trying to create a sedgy wetland over to the right on this slide. And we really thought we had it. So this is a place where the butterfly was originally discovered in 1983, and there was a population of about 300. Well, it was quickly lost and it wasn't seen there for decades. So we got involved with our restoration, and we introduced a few butterflies, and the population started growing. And I told you there were 3,000 of these butterflies on the Earth. Well, we had built a population to 500 to 600 butterflies. I mean, it was nuts how we were able to succeed, we thought, in restoration. But the key is that we thought we succeeded, and very quickly the population declined again. This was one population that we thought we had restoration worked out, and then we didn't. And as it turns out now, across the whole range, only 2 individual butterflies have been seen since September 2022. Realistically, the butterfly could be extinct. We're still checking. But this is not the only butterfly that's threatened. Here's another butterfly, the Miami blue that I've worked with in South Florida. Its population, it was widespread across South Florida, and then by the early 90s, it was limited to 5 populations across the southern part of the state. And they started disappearing. So in 1990, 91, 92. And then in 1992, it was thought that Hurricane Andrew took out the last population, and it was thought to be extinct. But luckily, some butterflies were rediscovered on one of the Florida Keys, and then another, and I got involved kind of in this period. But now no individuals have been seen since 2022. And then a third example, I've not worked on the Lang's meadowlark. This is found out in the San Francisco Bay Delta. No individuals have been observed since 2022. And my point here is to say, Elise talked about all butterflies, a quarter of all butterflies being lost over the last 2 decades. What the leading edge of this are the rarest butterflies that are being wiped from the face of the earth. Okay, so we have some idea now about causes. We know what the final state is or is going to be for butterflies, especially initially the leading edge, the rarest butterflies that are being lost. But now I'm going to just say one word about Elise and my story arc. Elise and I thought about this a lot over the last year that I don't know if any of you have seen the possible story arcs. Kurt Vonnegut has a nice slideshow on this, but I'm not going to tell you about all the story arcs. I'm just going to tell you about the one we're on now. It's the from bad to worse story arc, the one you never want to be on, the one where the main character, in this case butterflies, gets worse and worse and there's no sign of improvement. And so this is like my attempt to, and at least in my attempt to turn the story from the bad to worse story to the man in the hole story arc, where yes, we've dug ourselves down into a deep hole. Can we start to claw ourselves out and see butterflies turn course? So with that, I'm going to talk about 3 realistic paths to conservation of butterflies. And I want to start by talking about 2 of the rarest butterflies in the world. It turns out that I moved 8 years ago to Michigan State University, and who knew that Michigan was a hotspot for the rarest butterflies in the world? So I'm just going to this is a place that we have in the John Ball Sioux to grow out butterflies for restoration and release for recovery. But let me tell you about one of these butterflies, the pouch-cheeked skipperling. And This butterfly, it's every dot on this map is a place where in 1995 you could see the butterfly. It's basically throughout the Midwest CASC region. Now, today, you can see the butterfly in 3 populations that are in green. So the 2 are to Southeast Michigan side, and then 1 way up in Manitoba. And so what we're doing in our lab now at the John Ball Zoo is growing. We've captured a few individuals. We can grow them at high rates in greenhouse or hoop house facilities, and then release them into newly restored places. And so that's one example of just intensive efforts to recover rarest butterflies. Another one, this is also working at the John Ball Zoo, is work on a Mitchell's satyr butterfly that's found in this interesting distribution from Michigan, that's the bluish area, down to Alabama, Mississippi, that's the yellowish area. And postdoc Cinnamon Matan Moreau, who's got funding from Midwest CASC, to ask the question, can we use genetic rescue by introducing genes from the southern part of a range into the northern part of the range to try to protect the populations of butterflies that are undergoing climate change. And by the way, I have to give a shout out. I see Katie Kelly and Tamika Danridge are on this call from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who've been super supporters and have kind of been in it with us lockstep as we work towards the recovery of the butterfly. Okay, so first, we're looking at intensive effort for the recovery of the rarest species. Then what else can we do to reverse course and try to see butterfly populations stabilize or increase? Well, another is, the clear message from our work and just in general is ending the prophylactic use of insecticides. So I mentioned earlier that insecticides are now put on about 100% of corn seeds and about 40% of soybean seeds. And this you can compare from 2000 to now. So every seed that's going in across 100 million acres of the US, of the Midwest CASC region, has insecticide on it, whether or not there is a pest problem. And this is where it gets like kind of just bewildering. The insecticides are put on even though corn pests are already controlled by genetically modified crops. And so there's functionally no value most of the time in these insecticides. And so a majority of farm fields gain no economic or yield benefits from use of these toxic insecticides that we think are also having this spillover effect in reducing butterflies. Okay, so I talked about intense effort for the rare species, what I think is an easy effort, eliminating prophylactic use of insecticides. And then I'll give you one other big area where I think we can improve conservation. And the bottom line is to conserve a large number of declining butterfly species, we have to conserve and restore habitat. And like you're thinking, I would be thinking, or you're thinking, yeah, well, we can all conserve habitat. We can look out our windows probably and see places where conservation can happen. But how is that going to reverse this rapid decline of butterflies? And I'll show you an answer to this. And it reminds me to tell you that when Elise and I back, 6 months ago, were doing an interview with the New York Times about the declining butterflies story, the reporter, Katrin Einhorn, said, yeah, I want to run a story about this, but I'm also looking for stories on the environment that aren't doom and gloom. And, like the one we were pitching her about decline of butterflies. And so immediately, Elise and I pitched a different story. This is the one I'm going to tell you. And it ran in the New York Times yesterday under the title Hidden in Plain Sight. And what it's about is where conservation can happen in the US Midwest across over 20 million acres. So there's 100 million acres of corn soy in the US. It turns out that a quarter of that area is consistently under yielding and should not be farmed. It's a benefit to farmers, to the environment, to all of us, people who pay taxes, to not farm this area and see it restored to perennial vegetation. And it's just an immediate way to elevate populations of butterflies and other insects. And yeah, and so then that's one area that's millions of acres that are hidden in plain sight. I think there's others. I think about roadsides that could become habitat for butterflies, potentially solar fields, potentially, and then urban gardens that can become pollinator habitat. Okay, so I'm going to end with a couple slides. This one is to ask, well, is this just butterflies? And I love this quote from Henry Walter Bates that says, as the laws of nature must be the same for all beings, the conclusions furnished by butterflies must be applicable to the whole organic world. Therefore, the study of butterflies, creatures selected as the types of airiness and frivolity, will someday be valued as one of the most important branches of biological sciences. Have to love that quote as a butterfly person, but right now with butterfly decline as one of, I think, understanding and resolving it, one of the grand challenges of biology. I think this is particularly true because butterflies, as far as we know, are great indicators for all insects. There's not as much data on long-term decline or long-term patterns of abundance for other insects, but the information there is says that all insects are declining as fast as butterflies are. And so finally, I'll just say, I always have to talk about why do we conserve butterflies. I think first, they're the canaries in the coal mine for other insects. They're parts of healthy ecosystems, like they are pollinators, they are prey. They have economic value. I have a different study that's shown that butterflies are responsible for 10% of cotton yield. So if you're wearing a cotton shirt, then it's partly there because of butterflies. And then finally, this is thinking about the rarest butterflies for now, but I just think that we do have to throw in that it's important ethically that we shouldn't be the cause of butterfly extinction. And then I'll just, The Economist had this magazine article a few years ago, and it said, the insect apocalypse is not here, but there are reasons for concern. And now here we are 6 years later, I'm thinking, God, maybe we are here. But they did end by saying insects are indicators of ecosystem health. Their decline is a warning to pay attention to it before it really is too late. And I think that's the situation we face now. Okay, I'll leave it at that. I saw Ryan Drum on the call, was also part of the Status of Butterflies working group, and many others too. Thanks. So yeah, I'll turn it back over, and I don't know, Elise and I are happy to answer questions, or how do you proceed from here?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nick and Elise, for great presentations. We are going to turn it over to questions now. Feel free to put questions in the chat. I see we might already have one in there. Or if you want to raise your hand, I will let you go off mute and ask your question directly. All right, I am gonna add Elise to our screen here. One that we have in the chat regarding Nick's third way to conserve and in particular fostering butterfly habitat in roadsides. Texas has for decades focused on planting native flowers along roadsides. Is there data from Texas showing how doing so can make a difference?
So I don't know from Texas, but luckily I'm glad you asked this question because my former student is now the science director for the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, so I could ask him. But the best data I know is from a paper done by Elise and my colleague Leslie Reese, where she worked in Iowa, which also has dedicated programs for pollinator roadside conservation. And I often get the question, like, are we just creating ecological traps where butterflies are going to be attracted next to the roads and then fly across the road and be splatted? And what Leslie found is that butterflies are attracted to roadside habitats, but their their behavioral, like behaviorally, they respond to the presence of the roadside vegetation by moving along the roadside vegetation, not across the road. And so the mortality rate was no different in areas with roadside prairie than without. So I think they're a net benefit. There are times when roads are clearly bad but yeah, anyway, it's a different topic.
Okay, we've got another question in the chat here. I'm curious about the relative importance of different strategies. Would you rank the strategies, or would you try to avoid that? Perhaps increasing habitat in fields under solar, for example, versus genetic rescue.
So, I think because the problem is so big and affects so many different kinds of species, that I would prioritize ones that could have an effect on lots of other species. So, for example, an entirely different project that I'm working on is looking at grassland species, actually in Minnesota, bird species. And what we're finding is like the size of the remaining like prairie shortgrass habitats is not really large enough to buffer declines of birds. And the reason I bring that up is because I can see sort of strategies that would be a win-win for birds and probably multiple different butterfly species, where if we were increasing habitat, restoring those areas, I think that would probably help more broadly. I mean, genetic rescue or things like translocations, they can be really helpful for a single population, but you're really limited on how much you're probably able to do. So I think, and I mean, from my experience, was working on this with amphibians. It's just really hard to get done. It's really hard to get permitting and get people involved. So I think there's a lot of benefit to trying to think about strategies that'll help multiple species and even multiple taxa.
Thanks, Nick, for dropping that link to the New York Times article in the chat. If folks haven't seen that, I want to check it out. Another question here. Did you learn anything from the data curation integration process about how we might better standardize long-term butterfly monitoring methods to make future tracking easier? You're laughing, so I'm guessing that means yes.
That's Elise's question to answer. We worked hard with the postdoc on this, but especially Elise.
Well, no, I mean, really, the person who did a lot of this work was Leslie Reese, and she works with a lot of the different long-term butterfly monitoring programs. There are some things that I think are going to be hard through times and hard through time to get standardized, but like name changes, that was a big one. And then a big one also, right? Like, are these two species? Are these one species? Like, there was a lot of that going back and forth, and regionally people use different names, and even different programs use different names or different butterfly codes. So I don't know about a great answer to that. I mean, I'm hoping with the approaches that we've taken now that we'll have some sort of, some sort of feelings for the people who are working on it to try and want to standardize or use those approaches. However, on the other hand, most of these programs, a lot of these programs are done by citizen scientists, by volunteers, right? So I do think it's a hard sell, right? I think they're already doing so much work, and a lot of these programs are operating on a shoestring budget. So there might not be like a ton of ways that we could incentivize the standardization, because there's not, the funding isn't necessarily coming from the standard places where we think about that. But I think we're on that process, and platforms that aggregate data, I think are helping with that.
Thanks.
I think one other addition to that is if like a low-hanging fruit to me is every state developing a butterfly monitoring protocol like there are in many states already, like Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, and others. What those states have found is that it's I shouldn't say easy, that it can be done by citizen scientists for long periods of time over large areas. And there's no reason it couldn't be done in every state. At least brought up the fact that there's like holes in the country, like South Dakota, North Dakota, that have almost no surveys, but we can do it. And we can do it for butterflies. We can't do it for almost any other insect yet.
Speaking of other insect groups, we've got a question asking whether the triad of threats, pesticides, climate, and habitat, hold for other insect groups or if it's specific to butterfly, or if you don't know.
I mean, I have no data on this, so I'm just saying it from my gut, which is my guess is it holds for other insects, but I have no basis for saying that.
The best data, the best worldwide synthesis for insects has very much less data than we showed, at least showed for butterflies. But I mean, it's hard to make up how similar the trend is across all insects as it is to across butterflies in these intensive definitive studies across the United States. So like, we don't know as much, as Elise said, we can't know as much, but the signs are ominous.
And also the bees. I mean, there's the recent analysis, right, by Melissa Guzman on bees across the US and pesticides. So when it's looked at, when there is data available, it does appear that it's similar to what's going on for butterflies. But yeah, there's a lot of unknowns. Prairie strips. That's a Nick question.
Go for it.
I love this question. Thank you for asking it, because my student Annabelle is about to defend her thesis on, let's see, October 15th. I should send a Zoom link around because she resolves this question. This question I get from
Resolves.
every person, resolves at least from some butterflies. Anyway, get this question from farmers, from scientists, from like the New York Times. I copied a link to this article last week, and the reporter called me and she says, I only have one question for you. And it's the exact question you have listed here. But what Annabelle found was that she tracked butterfly performance, their behavior. Do they lay eggs in prairie strips? And then what's their performance, their survival as eggs through caterpillars to adult? And she found that butterflies do as well as, or sometimes even better than, reference prairie nearby. And I mean, one of the issues we all have to realize is that these pesticides are saturating our environment. So she measured pesticide loads in prairie strips, like right next to farm fields, and in reference prairie that might be miles away. And guess what? Pesticides show up there too.
Why better? Is there any, do you know why it would be better?
I know, well, that is a big question. I mean, we have some hypotheses about what the predator community might be like around in the prairies versus in the prairie strips versus reference prairie. That was surprising. That was surprising. I would just say equal to or better.
All right, folks, we are out of time, but thank you for the great questions. I'm sure if you have additional questions, you could reach out to Nick and Elise. Their emails will be included in our wrap-up recording email that you'll get later this week. Lots of applause. Love to see that. I'm going to pop up a quick closing poll. We would love for you to fill it out before you hop off today. Thanks again for joining us. Thank you, Nick and Elise.